potentially harmful platforms. Today, we are debating how we implement that initiative after the government accepted the Coalition's position. The Coalition tried to legislate for age verification trial in November, but the Albanese government opposed it and are still months away from any real action. The Coalition has been at the forefront of advocating for this crucial change because we believe it is essential for the safety, health and well-being of our children. There is growing evidence that social media is having a serious negative impact on the mental health of young Australians. Over the past decade, mental health conditions among children, especially girls, have significantly increased, and social media is a key contributor to this distress. On these platforms, children are exposed to unfiltered content from anyone, anywhere, often anonymously. Much of this material is inappropriate and unhealthy for young audiences and their developing brains. Children frequently encounter bullying, harassment and other harmful behaviours. Additionally, these platforms are designed to fuel addiction, and we don't yet fully understand how the algorithms employed by social media companies work and how or who they can be influenced by. As a society, we would never have intentionally allowed our children to be exposed to such dangers, yet this is happening every day on social media. This is unacceptable. Again, as Shadow Assistant Minister for Regional Health, I want to pick up on a comment an Optometry Australia representative made to me about the way devices are affecting children's eyesight, with a distinct increase in myopia attributed to devices. Banning social media access for children under 16 won't fix that directly, but indirectly removing one of the reasons to be on the devices will certainly help. I come now to the very important subject, arguably no more important subject in public policy, namely respecting and preserving parental authority. Where we need to draw a distinction is between permanently undermining parental rights and giving effect to the collective will of parents through this Parliament to help protect our children, their children. That line of distinction is less a line and more of a smudge, a grey area, which is why this debate is so important. As a member of the National Party, I champion individual responsibility and therefore understand concerns about government interfering in parental decision-making. But it is clear to me that this is a public health issue where nuanced policy making is required to protect children from all walks of life, including those whose parents are not aware of, are not concerned about, or don't have the digital skills or capacity to control their child's use of social media themselves. Let me be clear. I respect and support parents' wishes to have primacy as determining what they allow their children to do. I also respect the democratic view of parents represented in this place to show the Parliament has their back. A good example is where state governments have helped parents of teenagers in another way, restricting their rights for a limited and vulnerable time in the driver's seat. States control the hours that provisional drivers licence holders, P-platers, can drive, how many people can be in their car, even in some cases the power of the engines those young people can drive. Too many parents have lost a child. Too many communities, many of them regional communities, have endured the heartache of a tragedy from young people not ready to drive responsibly. The tragedy is not the same, but equally tragic when it comes to young lives lost to the negative impacts of social media. Just as P-plater restrictions save lives, this reform will save lives as well. P-plater restrictions help parents who in some cases either or both struggle to control or know what their children's behaviours are. A control on when and how children under 16 can use social media helps parents who can have greater difficulty exercising their authority over teenagers. Similarly, as the Shadow Minister said earlier in this debate, state governments have imposed mobile phone bans in schools to keep school children focused on their schooling. The dominant feedback from teachers, as I understand it, has been overwhelmingly positive about the impact these bans have had in the classroom and around the school grounds. The Coalition strongly believes that protecting online privacy is fundamental to the successful delivery of this ban. That is why we opposed the Albanese government's digital ID laws earlier this year, citing concerns over privacy implications. It is crucial that any social media regulations safeguard the privacy of Australians. Some in the community have tried to politicise this issue and whip up hysteria about it. In reality, that's not what this legislation is about. While this bill is not perfect, it's another tool to support parents in their challenging role. We should not conflate this with digital ID. In her second reading of this bill, the Honourable Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, said, and I quote, "The bill makes it explicit that platforms must not use information and data collected for age assurance purposes for any other purpose unless the individual has provided their consent." And I would say, watch what you tick. Also, she says, once the information has been used for age assurance or any other agreed purpose, it must be destroyed by the platform or any third party contracted by the platform. The Minister told Question Time on Monday, and I quote, "We have made clear the digital ID framework is not in scope and would not be used for age assurance." As an opposition and prospectively as the next government, we will hold the Minister accountable to that pledge. I highlight again that earlier this year the Coalition opposed the government's half-baked digital identity bills. The key principle here is protecting children from harm while ensuring privacy is protected. That said, I am critical of this government for limiting consultation on this legislation so tightly and preventing adequate community input and debate in the Senate. Only 24 hours was provided for public submissions on this bill, and a turnaround time of 3 business days was imposed on the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee to report on this bill. There were a mere 3 hours of public hearings held yesterday. These impediments to parliamentary process are unnecessary and unhelpful in finding the right balance between health and safety, supporting parents in their authority and privacy. Labor has been driving with the handbrake on when it comes to this bill, taking their sweet time to get moving and take steps towards tangible action. Now we are in the final sitting week of the year. The brake has suddenly been taken off and the pedal is flat to the floor. And Labor is racing to get this legislation to the finish line with limited due process. The inevitable result will be unintentional consequences, and improvements need to be made by the next government. I must reiterate, this is Labor's bill. The Coalition acknowledges the imperfections in this bill but remains keen to see parents provided with support to protect their children from the harms of social media.
I call the honourable member for North Sydney to seek leave.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I seek leave in continuation.
Is leave granted?
It's granted.
Leave is granted. Please proceed.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Now, this is exactly what many have been calling for. I therefore encourage the government to focus on the duty of care legislation rather than rushing this blunt bill. After all, there is a positive precedent for duty of care approach with the EU's Digital Safety Act obliging companies to design and operate their platforms to ensure people aren't harmed. Likewise, the United Kingdom legislation prevents access to content that promotes eating disorders or suicide. Here I want to acknowledge the work of the member for Goldstein, who this week introduced her Online Safety Amendment Digital Duty of Care Bill 2024. In stark contrast to what we have in front of us, this alternative bill has been developed over a period of 18 months in consultation with experts, carers and young people. Importantly, the member for Goldstein's bill addresses the underlying issues relating to online harm. I therefore thank her for her work and urge the government to withdraw their bill and bring hers on for debate. To proceed with the legislation as it currently stands sets us up for failure. as evidenced by the failure of bans in other jurisdictions, including France and Canada. Concerningly, a ban has the potential to create a false sense of security for parents and complacency for platforms, leaving children who circumvent it with no protection against harmful content. Even if a ban could be enforced, there is a real risk it would drive young people to less regulated services where adults or regulators have less oversight. The government has also indicated online gaming services would fall beyond the scope of this legislation, despite games displaying many of the features cited as the core problems with social media, such as addictive features and potentially harmful content on social feeds. And I can't let that exclusion go unchallenged, as I have personal experience with friends who have had their kids refuse to go to school because of their gaming addiction. Beyond concerns around the potential impact of an age ban on access to useful information, some of my community have also raised concerns with the bill's implications for privacy. The age assurance trial is set to examine methods from estimation to inference to full-blown identity verification. With the former, we risk false positives, as systems approximate a potential user's age. With the latter, users may be required to upload personal ID documents that many will rightly feel uncomfortable sharing. Ultimately, the more rigorous the test, the greater the risk that the right to privacy will be infringed, and this is something my community of North Sydney cares deeply about. More than a decade ago, the then Attorney-General, who also happens to be the current Attorney-General, instructed the Law Reform Commission to conduct an inquiry into serious invasions of privacy in the digital era. Since then, academics and independent bodies like the Law Council have continued to call for action, arguing there is an urgent need for reform to strengthen protections for citizens and align Australian law with European law and parts of North America. This government then conducted another Privacy Act review with a report offering 116 recommendations tabled in February last year. The government response agreed fully to 38 proposals, in principle to 68, and no to 10. And according to the Attorney-General's website, the government is committed to introducing legislation to protect the personal information of Australians in 2024. Yet we have not even seen a draft of the new legislation, and instead we have this bill, which does nothing to offer any greater protection to anyone, including our children. Rather, this bill will likely require personal identification or biometric data for all Australians to be gathered by the platforms. And so, like many in my community, I'm confused by the government's priorities. Other concerns related to this bill include the sharing of data with third-party verification services, the creation of databases linking real identities to online accounts, requirements for platforms to track Australian user location, and the creation of infrastructure for content monitoring, not to mention the potential for commercial surveillance of Australians. With all of that said, I also think it's unacceptable that the government is using its concern for the potential harms of online content to ban social media for under-16s, but won't ban online gambling advertising, despite the overwhelming evidence of the good an advertising ban would do. Rather than pursue the bill in front of us then, I urge the government to focus on empowering young people to curate their feed and ensuring parents feel comfortable having conversations with their children about the use of these tools in their day-to-day lives. I also encourage them to force the platforms to give users the ability to reset their algorithm and ensure they are held to account for providing broader education on what is possible, because we can already restrict the time a young person spends on their devices, we can restrict the type of content someone sees, and we can already implement strategies that provide a trusted source with an oversight on how a young person is engaging online. As a 12-year-old told me confidently just last week, it's all in the settings, silly. Ultimately, while I agree we need to ensure our kids are safe, this bill simply doesn't do that. Rather, this bill offers a blunt instrument that fails to meaningfully address the real problems of social media or hold platforms accountable for making their services safe for young people. And for this reason, I move the second reading amendment as circulated in my name. Thank you.
Is the amendment seconded?
I second the amendment and reserve my right to speak.
Seconded by the member for Warringah. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for North Sydney has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to. And I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to bring attention to the state of the House.
Is quorum required? Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Quorum present. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. And I call the Honourable Member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the time of, as we move towards nanobots, nanobots with recursive self-improvement, the capacity of AI to take a whole new dimension in how we do the analysis of what happens, then I believe, well, I always hoped there'd be the wit and the capacity from multi-billion-dollar companies and multi-billionaires to incorporate that technology in how people speak to one another. This is not so much this is not person to person, this is person to phantom. The evil, insidious nature of what happens online. Mr Deputy Speaker, I know this is a contentious issue for many, but I have incredibly strong views about why we should have protections in there for the vulnerable who, in this environment of getting online as they come home from school, I'll be honest, 14-year-old girls around about that time, we haven't properly developed a sense of proper agency in what's happening around you. A person has the capacity to come into your life, not a person, an evil thing, a phantom, and to completely turn that person's life upside down. To play with their personality, to play with their ego, like a cat plays with a ball of string. To destroy that person, and they really can. For many parents, they have lived through this incredibly evil and destructive experience, where a person who's happy, who's fun-loving, is taken to the edge of death. with issues such as anorexia, where we stand back and say, well, what can we do? I mean, would you allow them, just because it was free, to play with firearms or to play with dynamite? I really mean it. It's as dangerous as that. Not for everybody, but for the vulnerable, for the person who starts competing with this unknown entity, starts to get tries to justify their position, tries to get a form of self-worth against we don't know what, another person, either named or unnamed. We've seen the tragedy already of the young lady near Strathfield, I think it was Santa Sabina, committed suicide the other day. We've seen other young girls who've taken their own life. And we have a responsibility to do something about it. It might not be perfect, but we've got to do something. You can't just sit back and say, oh, this is too hard. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have been on this case for years. People say, oh, you need more time. I've been pursuing this for years. I remember going to the United States of America to see Senator Ted Cruz, and also on one side, and the Democrat senator from the state of Washington on the other. Mr. Deputy Speaker, they're a lot more forward-leaning than we are. I don't think you'd find that they're sort of some sort of socialist cabal. They are a lot more forward-leaning. I watched them actually with a sense of real sort of encouragement and with a real sense of purpose as they absolutely eviscerated people from Facebook, from Instagram, basically saying, you'll either fix this or we will take your licence off you. We haven't even gone partway down the path that basically invective has. We have got to clearly understand that these companies could have done something. It's not as if they haven't heard about this. They choose not to. That is the problem. They choose not to. They choose not to because they make an incredible amount of money from advertising having this group of people as part of their cohort. This is not the misinformation and disinformation bill. That one's been parked into oblivion, and I have not heard an obituary raised by those in the Labor Party or the Greens about how they're sad about the misinformation and disinformation bill being buried. It went without a whimper. It died a miserable death and was cut out. But there's a fundamental difference about that. See, what that is about is your right in passive observation to assess information that is before you and make your mind up as to whether you believe it or not, as to whether you absorb it, as to whether it informs you or not. As long as it's not even on criminality, it can't inform you to murder someone, it can't inform you that there's some sort of differentiation on DNA between humankind, but that information does not talk back to you. You observe it, and then you make your mind up about it. When you read a paper, the newspaper does not talk back to you. When you watch a television, the television does not talk back to you. You make your judgment about what you are seeing. But this is entirely different. It talks back. It talks back. And it says the most vile, horrendous things to people, beautiful, young people, who at that point in their life are looking for self-affirmation, who are looking for the capacity to see themselves amongst their peers, and who get sucked into this vortex that destroys lives. And it really does. The reason this is supported by some media houses is not because the media houses believe that it's a winner, because mums and dads think it's a winner. Because mums and dads want this dealt with. And we have a responsibility to do something about it. Now, is this the perfect solution? No. Nothing that goes through this chamber is a perfect solution. It's the best attempt. It's us trying to do what we can, but it's not perfect. You know what the great thing about the Parliament is, Mr. Speaker? If it's not perfect, we can fix it. It is not beyond our wit to say, oh, well, if in the future changes need to be made, we will make them. And hopefully we'll make them in the same bipartisan way as what we're doing this. Because I don't believe for 1 second that either on either side believes that in the majority that this is a tenable situation. So what we are attempting to do with this bill is find a way to start the process to alleviate the problem that we have before us. We have made vastly more contentious moves in the past, and obviously one that comes to mind was obviously after Port Arthur was control of firearms. And I acknowledge Member for Solomon, myself, we've had quite a bit to do with firearms in our stage. I don't think any of us would go back now and say, well, you've got to have semi-automatic weapons in your cupboard and, take them out for a run in the park. No one believes in doing that. Yet, at the time, there was tremendous uproar, massive uproar. And I live on the land. I own rifles. But if someone said to me, I want a, Kalashnikov, I'd say, why? You don't. I need a F-88 Steyr. No, you don't. Not unless you want to join the army. Then you can be issued one from the armory, trot around with it, in full kit. But this is, this I believe in the future will people say, well, why didn't you do that earlier? It is something that is before us now, and as we go to a period in the next year where it'll be the fog of the election, this is something that we can deal with now. I pleaded with the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison that we had to do something about this. It was one of the things I brought up continuously. When are we going to do something about Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Bezos and all these other cohorts that are capitalising on the misery of so many families? It's an amazing thing, Mr. Speaker. People say, oh, you just tell your kids to get off it. Yeah, if that was the case, there'd be no one who smokes. You just say to them, don't smoke. But 10% of people do. 10% of people do. And I would say 99% of that 10%, no, it's no good for you. But they do it. They do it. And when you see a child and they're on their tablet and swipe right, swipe left, and bang, 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 their fingers move so quickly and they're all across it, and you can see that interaction, and it is the most amazing, scary thing from a very young age. From a very young age when they start Minecraft. When they wake up early in the morning, go to the side of your bed, take the charger off you, sneak off, get on your phone, do all those tricks, just wake you up slightly with the phone in front of you. You look at it, facial recognition, thank you, off they go, back onto it. When they can actually download programs. Now that's starting at a very young age. That's starting at a very, very young age. And what's in the back of your mind is, Minecraft, it's passive. Them engaged with the thing, but it's the start of the process. In the end, you say, I know it's coming. Instagram. I know it's coming. TikTok. I know it's coming, where they will engage in that swill, in some nice things, but that swill of those evil people looking for the vulnerable. They get a kick, Mr. Deputy Speaker, out of hurting people. They get an endorphin kick. It makes them feel good. They don't care. In fact, some of this total and utter filth holds it as a prize if they kill you. It's a win. It is the crime you can get away with. As Rooster 123, as you're out there as Rooster 123, or Prince Charming engaged with Jane Smith as 13 years old at the local high school. You know, Jane, you're fat. Jane, you should lose some more weight. Jane, you're a loser. Jane, you should kill yourself. You're nothing but rubbish. And is that mythical? Is that overstating it? No, it's not. That's how it works. The terrifying outcome that so many families have, and they finally find out what's going on. And then having to engage the psychologists, the psychiatrists, to try and deprogram this insidious program that's happened. To get to that point in your life where you say to another person, what are you doing to yourself? Where you get that point where they have no control over their life anymore. That it has been rewired by this engagement in a multi-billionaire's money-making machine. In this multi-billionaire's money-making machine that makes them the richest person in the world. And whilst they acquire that massive wealth and sit there in their T-shirt and parade like some sort of quasi-god on the stage in front of the adoring fans, they don't have the capacity to quietly stand back and say and contextualise all the mechanisms and all the attributes of how they made that money. And say to themselves in that quieter moment, under my principles, under the rules I live in my life, under the things that guide me in my compass, is what I am doing right? Is this good? Is this right? Is this just? Have I created harm? Am I responsible for hurting someone? And the answer to that question is yes, you are. Yes, you are. But they don't do anything about it. So we have to do what is second best. We have to make our best attempt. We have to try and do what is right. And this bill is our best attempt to do what is right.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for McKellar.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on the Online Safety Amendment Social Media Minimum Age Bill 2024. Deputy Speaker, I am a mum to 3 teenage children, and I know that parents across McKellar find themselves in a similar predicament to me, and that is trying to help our children navigate their childhood and teen years in the digital era. Not an easy task. I'm also a member of a generation which is so pleased to have lived through our formative years without a screen and without social media in particular. Social media encourages us to constantly compare ourselves to others and can serve up unsolicited, harmful content, neither of which is conducive to good mental health. And it's difficult for everyone. Technology changes far more quickly than policy, than academic analysis, than legislation, and than governments do. It's hard for everyone to keep up. But federal governments are elected to do hard things, and this should be no different. Before getting to the bill itself, I'd like to commend the government for tackling this challenging but incredibly important topic in its first term, as the need is urgent. I think it's important to recognise that the intention here is to protect our children and young people from harm. This, of course, is commendable. And let's be clear, there are significant harms being dished up to our children every day as they scroll through social media. Eating disorder content, violent pornography, the normalisation of misogyny, and gambling, alcohol and junk food promotions that are specifically targeted to them. A 2023 eSafety Commission report found that 75% of all 16 to 18-year-olds surveyed in Australia had seen online pornography, and almost one-third of those had encountered it before the age of 13. It found that 60% of young people were exposed to pornography on social media, often unintentionally on popular sites including TikTok, Instagram and Snapchat. All the while, young people's online activity and data is being harvested by these large corporations, with thousands of labels being attached to them, and this data sold to innumerable companies for the purpose of targeted advertising. I recently conducted a social media survey myself in the electorate of Mackellar to get a feel for what people were thinking about this social media ban for those under the age of 16. It was split down the middle, for and against, but basically everyone agreed on one thing, and that was that something must be done to protect young people online. Many, however, felt that the ban that we are debating today was too blunt an instrument, that it would not be effective and could be easily circumvented. Some argued that rather than introducing a ban, other measures should be introduced to make the online environment safer. One constituent summed up this issue by writing, "Nice idea in principle, but would more likely end up cutting off vulnerable youth from support services. Unfortunately, there are some mental health and medical resources that only exist on social media. The EU is considering legislation that would prohibit algorithms dictating your feed, instead having social media only give information from users you actively follow. This may be a better compromise." And so, Deputy Speaker, I now seek to introduce the second reading amendment circulated in my name. The second reading amendment highlights the problems with this bill, and they can be summarised quite easily. Do it at the end. Firstly, there are no grandfathering provisions. It is entirely unclear how platforms will be required to manage the many millions of existing users who are now set to be excluded and deplatformed. Those children under 16 who are already on the designated platforms have been on it for years and who will now, in theory, be required to step away from it. Secondly, the legislation is far too vague in stipulating how social media platforms are to comply with their obligation to prevent under 16s from having an account, stating only that it will likely involve some form of age assurance as a means of identifying whether a prospective or existing account holder is an Australian child under the age of 16 years. For what is supposed to be world-leading legislation, this doesn't seem adequate. Thirdly, under 16s will still be able to watch videos on YouTube and see content on Facebook. The ban is only designed to stop them from creating an account. But without legislation in place that imposes a duty of care on social media platforms to ensure that harmful content cannot be shared, young people are still at risk of harm while supposedly relaxing in their bedrooms. I do acknowledge that work has commenced to create duty of care legislation to compel social media platforms to prevent harm from occurring on their sites. But of course, as with all things political and legislative, there is no guarantee that this legislation will come to fruition for years, if at all. A case in point is the gambling advertising ban bill, which, despite being so urgent and necessary, has been kicked off to the long grass by the government this week, as all too hard and all too scary with the looming election. In much more general terms, however, I remain concerned that this bill has the potential to actually negatively impact children by severing their access to vital mental health resources and social supports, which are critical for the very large number of young people already experiencing mental health challenges. There are also significant privacy concerns. Population-wide age verification raises serious concerns about data security and privacy affecting both minors and adults. We also know that age bans trialled in 10 other countries have failed. I acknowledge that technology has moved on since many of these trials were conducted, but it is also inevitable that many children under 16 years old will be able to bypass the age restrictions, thereby finding themselves inhabiting unregulated, darker spaces that they would otherwise not have found themselves in. This may have a chilling effect on young people. They may find themselves in even more harmful spaces than they would have been otherwise in were it not for the ban. And being on these platforms illegally may mean they don't seek the support and help they need because they're worried about the legal repercussions, that is, getting into trouble. Fundamentally, though, the problem with simply evicting children from the platforms is that it absolves the social media companies from their responsibility to create safe, well-designed services for young users. Our laws should demand platforms take reasonable steps to resolve issues of safety and addictive design, while also offering better experiences for children. And that's where the danger of this superficial appeal of this legislation becomes most clear. Basically, this legislation, which simply bans those from under 16 from using social media, means that social media companies won't be compelled to address and solve the actual causes of harm on their platforms, both the algorithms that serve up harmful content to teenagers and the design principles which ensure addiction. According to Daniel Angus, a professor of digital communication and director of the Queensland University of Technology's Digital Media Research Centre, there are several things that the government should be doing to better avert harms that I've listed. First of all is to impose a duty of care on digital platforms. The government has announced that they're looking into this, which is welcome news. My crossbench colleague, member for Goldstein, has also introduced a private member's bill just this week, which would establish a digital duty of care, and I commend her for doing this. The member for Goldstein's contention, which many digital experts agree with, is that rather than age gating, we need safety by design. What that means is that instead of simply shutting kids out, we need to address and prevent the harm being caused in the first place. This is especially important when the government is far from clear how age gating will work. Which leads to the second recommendation from Daniel Angus, which is to enact regulations which will require platforms to give people more control over what content they see. Users should be able to change, reset or turn off their personal algorithm. And third is to create a children's online privacy code to better protect children's information online. This could be administered by the Children's Commissioner or the eSafety Commissioner, or both. These issues were comprehensively canvassed by a group of over 140 Australian and international experts who wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister last month. The view of that group is that an age-based ban on accessing social media is too blunt an instrument to address the risks effectively. I understand that this bill has been referred to the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee. In my short time here, I've always found Senate inquiries which provide the opportunity for further expert scrutiny inevitably result in improved legislation and outcomes. I particularly hope that the committee is actively seeking input from the children this bill seeks to regulate. The experts are telling us that children want safe online environments in which to socialise and be entertained. I look forward to reading the committee's report, which is actually due out today, and I will carefully review their recommendations as well as the input from my community of Mackellar, as ever, in making my final decision about whether to support this bill. Thank you.
Just for a moment, just for clarity, when the honourable member for McKellar. I think you may have mentioned that you were going to introduce an amendment. For the sake of hindsight, I just need you to move that amendment and then I'll call on your seconder before we move on.
Thank you. I move the second reading amendment as circulated in my name.
I do thank the honourable member. Is your amendment seconded?
I second the amendment and I reserve my right to speak.
I thank the honourable member for Fowler. So the original question was that this bill now be read a second time. To this, the honourable member for North Sydney moved as an amendment that all words after that be admitted with a view to substituting other words. The honourable member for McKellar has now moved an amendment to that amendment that all words after house be admitted with a view to substituting other words. The question is now that the amendment moved by the honourable member for McKellar to the amendment moved by the honourable member for North Sydney be agreed to, and with that, the question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I give the call to the most honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Online Safety Amendment Social Media Minimum Age Bill 2024, and it is a great pleasure for me to do so. Just at the outset, Deputy Speaker, I think it's important to start with how we have landed here. And we have landed here because we have had social media now in some form for around about 20 years. And we have given social media platforms the opportunity, and this has been successive governments, to self-regulate. They have failed to do so. And, Deputy Speaker, I heard the honourable member for New England. He drew the comparison with the gun legislation that was rightfully brought in by the Howard government and really led by former Prime Minister Howard, and that after the dreadful massacre in Port Arthur, and that was nation-changing and changed the way that we as a country looked at possession of guns, and that was the right decision for our nation. The social platforms, the social media platforms, Deputy Speaker, have proven to be completely recalcitrant in this. 4 decades ago, when we didn't have seatbelts in cars, the legislators of those days had a similar problem with car manufacturers who said, oh, it'll be too expensive to put seatbelts into cars. It is not really that much of an issue. People are dying from other injuries, not just from not wearing seatbelts. It's too hard to regulate. It's going to make cars too expensive. Well, Deputy Speaker, thankfully, the parliaments of those times had the courage to stand up to the car manufacturers and say no, because in the national interest, we must prevent people from dying from chest injuries or being rendered permanently paraplegic or quadriplegic through those injuries in car accidents. And, Deputy Speaker, we regulated it. The sky didn't fall down, the sky didn't fall in, and now our cars are safer than they've ever been, and indeed cars are now sold on the basis of safety features. So, Deputy Speaker, this is legislation that is completely necessary for us to change the course for our young people. This legislation broadly aims to set a minimum age of 16 for Australians to hold social media accounts. It requires age-restricted social media companies to take reasonable steps to prevent age-restricted users from having an account with the social media platform. And the entire objective of this legislation is to reduce the harm that social media is causing to young people. Deputy Speaker, when we hear reports of 11 and 12-year-olds taking their own lives because of bullying or because of some of the material that they are being subject to on social media, it is time that we said, we as the adults in this place, we as the legislators, as federal legislators, we must say no. We must stand up for our children. We cannot allow what has been allowed to occur, what the social media platforms have allowed onto their sites, to continue. And this is, at the first breath, about protecting our children going forward. And secondly, this empowers parents, Deputy Speaker, because I know as a parent, the hardest word to say to your children is no, but it is also, when it is the hardest to say, that is also the time when it is the most necessary to say it. And some of the arguments that have been put up against this legislation, to me, simply don't make sense. And I say this particularly, I was here for the member for McKellar, and I have a lot of respect for the honourable member, but a couple of the arguments that have come about have been around children with disabilities, or we are cutting off vulnerable youths from supports that are only on social media. Well, Deputy Speaker, don't we then have to change it so that those supports are available in other forums? This is not a ban on the internet. This is a ban on social media platforms for children under the age of 16, because they are children. And we have various other laws for our children. We say to them, you cannot drive a car under the age of 16 because we know that that is too dangerous. We say you cannot smoke cigarettes. We say you cannot drink alcohol. We say you should not be having sex under the age of 16. And these laws have all come in place over a period of time where our society has come to a point where it has been necessary to bring in prohibitions. And I am not usually a person who wants prohibitions brought in, Deputy Speaker, but they must be brought in when the harm, the activity that is to be prohibited, the danger of prohibition is far less than the danger that the activity is currently causing. Because I can't recall at the age of 11 or 12 knowing what suicide was. And the fact now that not only do Australian 11 and 12-year-old boys and girls know what suicide is, but they know how to take their own life, and they are taking their own life, this is an absolute tragedy. And we are in a place now where we can do something to prevent it, and so we need to do something to prevent it. We are not, the argument that, well, some kids are still going to get onto social media. Okay, but why are we making the good the enemy of the perfect in this? Some kids under the age of 16 still drive cars. Some kids under the age of 18, some kids under the age of 18 still drink alcohol, they still smoke cigarettes, they still do things that we do not want them to do. But it gives parents, this legislation gives parents back control. They can say, no, you cannot be on this. You can't be on Instagram, you can't be on Snapchat because it is against the law. And Deputy Speaker, my boys now are 18, and I just wish that this law had been in place when my husband and I were grappling with this when ours were younger. We tried everything to keep them off social media, but parents these days, parents are working, kids come home, they're on their phones, and parents cannot be sitting there with their children 24 hours a day looking at what they are watching, and indeed they shouldn't be. So this gives parents the ability to say no. And I think the other argument that that I just cannot accept is the argument that, oh, but what about the current 13 and 14-year-olds that are on social media? Oh, we're going to have to now say to them, you have to come off it. Yes, that's exactly right. We're the adults, we're the parents. Yes, 14-year-old, it's now the law, you have to come off it. And then they can go and they can whinge to all of their friends because, Deputy Speaker, this is a time when parents have to have the ability to be able to unite together and say, no, we are all as a wall here saying no. That's what it gives parents. It gives parents back control, and it gives parents the ability to not be the only parent in the group that says, no, you cannot be on social media. That's what this is important. I note that there have been, and if we just go back to how we got to this place, I want to commend the member for Banks, the Shadow Minister for Communications on this. He introduced, Deputy Speaker, a private member's bill back in November of last year, and it's now up for its 12-month anniversary, and I'm very glad to see that the government, the Communications Minister, has, after 12 months, decided to now come on board with a policy and legislation that initially originated from the Liberal Party, and particularly from the Shadow Minister for Communications, the member for Banks. And while we are there, the other members on my side who have been instrumental in getting the legislation to the place where it is today, the member for Flinders and also the member for Fisher, both of whom have been tireless advocates in this place to reduce the harm of social media on our children. So, Deputy Speaker, I thank all of those members. I've been inundated from my electorate by emails about this issue. Parents are crying out for assistance with this. They know, I mean, most times in your life when things go really pear-shaped, you can usually trace it back to when you haven't gone with your instinct. And parents have the correct instinct on this. They know that their kids are seeing things on social media, are being subject to bullying, they're being subject to various sites and other graphics that they know they do not want their children to see. And in the normal course, for example, back before social media, before the internet, very few children under the age of 18 were viewing pornography. There were a few, there always are, but it is very different to what is now available these days. And I mean, I hate to think what my kids have seen on social media. I really do, Deputy Speaker. And that is not good, because it is bad for both young boys and also for young girls. It is saying to young girls, you have to look this certain way, you have to perform this certain way. And it is similarly saying to young men, you have to perform this certain way, and by the way, it is okay to treat girls in this way. So, Deputy Speaker, and a lot of that is being circulated through social media. One of the other issues that I know that a lot of us have grappled with is about the protection of privacy, and it is very pleasing to see that the government has agreed to amend the legislation to include a clear provision stating that a person cannot be compelled to provide digital ID or other personal identity documents such as passports. And I know this is a big issue for some of my coalition members, particularly in the other place. It also prohibits platforms from using information collected for age assurance purposes for any other purpose unless explicitly agreed to by the individual. So what this means, Deputy Speaker, is that once information has been used for age assurance, it must be destroyed unless the individual agrees to it being retained. So, Deputy Speaker, I am quite comfortable with those privacy amendments, that this does provide adequate privacy and does address the concerns that have been raised by some of my colleagues here and also in the other place. So, to conclude, Deputy Speaker, this is good legislation. This is legislation that has been well thought through, and again, I do thank the government for coming on board with the initiative that was originally proposed by the member for Banks, and I commend the bill to the House, Deputy Speaker, for all of the reasons I've outlined. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for the contribution. And the question before the House now that the amendments be agreed to. And with that, I give the call to the most honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this bill seeks to provide protection for children under 16 years of age from the harms associated with social media. It does this by requiring social media platforms to take reasonable steps to prevent children from under 16 from opening and maintaining social media accounts. In principle, I do support this bill. The ubiquitous use of social media apps among teenagers and children has created an environment that no other generation has had to encounter. We know, and now, and I mean this is really every living person, we now live through our phones, don't we? And our tablets and the news that they provide, the envious review of friends' photos from an overseas trip, or a quick text chat with a friend or an acquaintance. Sadly, this easy access has also robbed us of more personal and meaningful communication, stuff we once enjoyed. One only has to look around in a restaurant to see couples of all ages head down in their phones scrolling through Facebook or Instagram at the expense of their dinner companion. Or the thing that I've seen too often in my community and other places around Australia is mums or dads sitting at the park on their phone while their children are on the equipment. As a society, we're losing the ability to communicate. As for the young, many are missing out on the opportunity to develop the very communication skills that are so necessary for social and physical and mental wellbeing. It is ironic that social media, the very tools that enable us to communicate more easily with others and other technological advancement before it, has in many respects, I think, had the opposite effect. Not too long ago, those aged 64 years and older had the highest reported rate of loneliness and feeling of isolation. Social media opened the world for older people to communicate directly with friends and family at their whim. However, now the loneliest cohort are the 16 to 24s, a complete inverse of historical loneliness records. The Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey, HILDA, which collects data on personal wellbeing, labour market dynamics and family life, provides an important insight into the lives of 17,000 Australians all over the course of their lifetime. The HILDA survey found that between 2011 and 2021, the rate of psychological stress among 15 to 25-year-olds increased by 120%. The Australian Psychological Society advised the psychologists report teenagers are determining their self-worth on the number of likes they receive, left feeling rejected if they don't receive instant approvals for their posts. In a recent media statement, the Society stated more than 4 in 10 Australian teens now suffer mental health distress, with experts drawing a link in the rise of cases with the use of social media. The rate of hospitalisation for intentional self-harm has also surged to 70% in young women aged 15 to 19 between 2008-9 and 2021-2022. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt argued digital platforms were not toxic in their original formulation, But everything changed at the beginning of 2009 when Facebook added the like button and later the share button. The adoption of social media and the introduction of engagement tools such as like and share functions demonstrates a disturbing correlation, a correlation which appears to specifically affect the younger generation. But as I said in my speech on the misinformation bill, this is legislation always the best form of action. And if we are going to legislate, I think it's really important that we don't rush it. And while acknowledging the negative aspects of social media and its indiscriminate effect on the young, there are many positive aspects. Social media provides opportunities for young people to digitally socialise, finding people with shared interests, and importantly has become a useful communication tool among peers and parents alike. There is a concern that removing under-16s from social media may have the adverse effect of further isolating a generation. Or worse, it may drive children to unregulated web channels and social media services. This was raised in several submissions to the bill. Unregulated platforms offer minimal or no safeguards and pose greater risks from bad actors. If we think children won't find a workaround, I do believe we are kidding ourselves. They are, after all, digital natives, and really none of us in this room could argue that we are digital natives. The merits of protecting our children are not up for debate. It is a must. What is up for debate is how we achieve this, and I think we need to do this very carefully. Rushing legislation has demonstrated time and time again to be a futile exercise. In fact, you could even say a dangerous exercise. We know from past experience that good legislation, particularly on major reforms such as this, requires extensive consultation and sufficient time for due diligence by members. And yet here we are, a bill where the government gave a mere 24 hours for feedback to the public. 24 hours. This is the antithesis of good legislative practice. And I think that's where my real concerns sit, Deputy Speaker, is that there is just, this feels like it's so incredibly rushed for legislation that's supposed to not really be in operation for more than a year, perhaps two. A bill that requires age verification to be undertaken by social media platforms, but is silent on how this occurs. We're told that these details will be worked out later. I can't recall a single piece of legislation being passed where the details of operation were not known. My concerns reflect those of many in my community. Yes, parents want a safer digital environment, but they're also adverse to tech giants having even greater access to personal data that they already have. The suggestion that these companies will only hold data for 24 hours provides no comfort. Neither does the thought that these companies are mining our social media accounts to guess what age we are. These intrusions are deeply problematic and simply do not address the underlying issues. They just delay the inevitable. The statistics on mental health deterioration, psychological distress and self-harm don't magically stop at 16. This bill does not necessarily make social media safer. It simply delays the danger until a young person turns 16. Good policy identifies a problem and, where appropriate, identifies a legislative fix. And this bill suggests children are the problem and delaying their access is the fix. And that just can't be so. It does nothing to protect children 16 years and over, and in doing nothing it actually creates data risks that were previously not there. We know in the business world that data is gold, and it appears like we're going to be gifting it to the social media monoliths by the pallet load. I've circulated amendments that I'll speak to later to provide necessary personal identification protections to the millions of social media users that will potentially require age verification if this bill passes. And I'm pleased to hear that apparently the government in the Senate will be putting forward amendments that pretty much mirror the amendments that I'm putting to this House. And so I'm not sure why we couldn't support it in this House and somehow try and improve this bill that's going to inevitably pass in this House before it gets to the other place. Deputy Speaker, I, like every other Australian, like every other parent, want to protect children, our nation's children, from the harms caused by social media. However, I am very much concerned from the privacy aspect, but also that this legislation is very rushed, insufficiently consulted on, and fails to address human rights concerns and consequently perhaps may not achieve the desired outcome. I just fail to understand why we are in such a hurry to do this in the last days of this year's parliamentary term. Why could we not have seen this bill months ago? Why can we not come back and look at this next year if it's not actually going to be in operation for a very long time? Since the minimum age obligation will not be activated for at least 12 months, there really is no justification in rushing through this bill. I think it's just here to serve a political imperative rather than a safety imperative. And so, Deputy Speaker, at this point I'm very vexed on how I should vote on this bill. I really am. It's a flawed bill. The principle is great. The principle I understand. The principle my community understands. But this legislation appears to be incredibly flawed. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for the contribution, and the question before the House now is that the amendments before the House be agreed to, and with that I give the call to the most honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The question of an increase in the threshold for creation of social media accounts from age 13 to age 16 has been brought into political consideration over recent months because of concerns regarding the impact of social media on the mental health and well-being of Australian children. The advent of social media has fundamentally transformed how humans spend their time and communicate. The repercussions of these changes are profound. The amount of time that children spend online is linked to accumulating research associating excessive and addictive use of digital media with adverse physical, psychological, social and neurological consequences. Researchers acknowledge a link between mental health disorders and social media usage. But it's important to note that that relationship does not confirm causation. The thesis of parents' groups and a recent pretty strong campaign by the Murdoch press is that increasing the age of those allowed on social media from 13 to 16 years would protect vulnerable young people from the dangers of social media. Deputy Speaker, it is true that if age verification could be comprehensively and effectively enforced, children and young people would be better protected from risks like cyberbullying and online predators. Limiting social media access might increase time for children to make other, more healthy lifestyle choices, like exercising or socialising in person with others, and that could improve their mental health, their sleep and their academic performance. Restricting access to the digital world might empower parents and guardians to better guide their children's online activities. A complete ban, were that possible, might also help with online privacy concerns. Social media platforms collect vast amounts of personal data from users. Children and adolescents simply don't understand how their data is collected, used and monetised. Banning access for younger users might mitigate privacy violations and limit the exploitation of personal data by large technology companies. Each of those concerns does carry some truth. We do need to address the harms caused by social media platforms. However, the overwhelming weight of expert evidence in this area is against this government's simplistic proposal of a blanket ban for young people aged less than 16. Speaker, this country has a confusing array of laws around young people. You can be criminally responsible at 10. You can join the Labor Party at 14. You can join the Liberal Party at 16. You can work full-time from 16 and you can vote at 18. The fact is that digital media are vital for young people's civic, social and cultural participation. This is a point which is often stressed in qualitative research involving young people. How can we tell growing adults that they need to hold off becoming fully fledged citizens and contributing members of society until they're 16? Young people have a right to freedom of expression and access to information. They also have an implied right to political communication, which has been flagged by some tech platforms as a possible basis for legal challenges to this legislation. Social media is a vital information source and a means of expression for many members of the LGBTQIA community, for Indigenous Australians, for young people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, from children who live in isolated areas, and for children and young people with a disability. This bill would block young people from the channels and the groups that are their public spaces, which are the forum for their everyday communication with their people. Young people access their news via social media. They know that legacy media doesn't reflect their interests. Legacy media makes little effort to engage with them, and it doesn't afford them the opportunity to communicate with each other in the way that they want to, IRL. The only exception to that rule, of which I'm aware in this country, is that of 6 News, the streaming channel founded in 2019 by Quorum resident Leo Puglisi. Leo has employed a number of young Australian journalists, as young as 13, in growing the only news and current affairs channel which presents the perspectives of people their own age. Young people conduct their businesses via social media. They use it to engage with other platforms, digital services, products, apps and sites. For example, YouTube compilation videos of TikTok content, sharing a story on Instagram, which is then going to Facebook and then to X. It's not easy to disentangle social media from other platforms. This is most obvious with the Chinese platform Weibo, which is integrated as a matter of course with multiple functions like posting, group chats and a digital wallet. Australians, young people, do know what they don't want to experience online. They don't want to experience unwanted content or contact, unwanted surveillance and use of their data. But they tell us they would like to see better guidelines and boundaries and to understand the acceptable use of online spaces. They want better education and training on online safety so that they can identify, recognise and thoroughly understand potential harms. Young people have told us that instead of reforming age verification laws, protection should be improved with stronger technology such as digital passwords and secure apps. They want improved monitoring, swift action, and they want accountability regarding online safety practices rather than reversing the onus and placing it purely on the user, a user who is physically and neurologically immature. Speaker, the advice of academics and other experts has been largely ignored or misinterpreted in the framing of this legislation. The bill even misrepresents the literature it cites about developmental ages and risks. It has dismissed the literally hundreds of Australian and international experts who have raised serious concerns regarding lack of benefit and potential harm resulting from the bill. It ignores the more than 100 submissions to this ridiculously and appropriately brief ticker-box Senate inquiry into the bill, which was held earlier this week. The legislation is going to rely on effective age assurance or verification processes being adopted. That means that all Australians will be required to prove their identity to access social media. Exactly how that is going to happen is completely unclear. The Minister has claimed that we won't be compelled to hand over our personal identification, but I note that that statement is at odds with the explanatory memorandum for the bill. The government has committed $6.5 million to a study of new age verification technology. That is a study which is due to report in 2025. But now the government proposes to give responsibility for the process over to the digital platforms, even though even Google and Meta say that they think it would be better to wait for the result of the review. Deputy Speaker, age verification is rife with privacy and digital security risks, as well as critical effectiveness and implementation issues. It is not a cure-all safeguard for children and for their data protection. Children's location data is extremely sensitive. There is significant potential for more, not less, data harvesting from children if we hand over to the platforms the power to verify and assure children's age. Meta has already told us that it will undertake age assurance using facial recognition, digital ID and other forms of software. Now, the international benchmark for digital governance, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, clearly defines individuals as the owners of their data. It states that consent for data use has to be freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous. In Australia, the lack of transparency of international digital platforms regarding how they collect, they share and use data leaves individuals exposed to algorithms which are based on their online habits. Protections for children are dependent on different rules on different platforms. There is a perception that regulating the collection and use of data collected by digital platforms is complex, but this is not the case. Digital platforms are predicated on rules and processes, and they can be amended accordingly. Mind you, those rules can be evaded by those children who lie about their age online and are then targeted with content for older age groups. Experience overseas and previous experience in this country suggests that a blanket ban will last about 5 minutes. Ask Stephen Conroy. Technological workarounds such as VPNs and false age declarations will inevitably undermine the effectiveness of this ban. The government has admitted that already. As the Tech Council of Australia has said, this bill will only add to the existing perceptions internationally that the Australian technology sector operates in an uncertain regulatory environment which can be subjected to rapid legislative change without due consideration. This legislation does not inspire confidence in this government. Regardless of how it's done, a ban is not going to address the root causes of online risks, and it's not going to make platforms safer for everyone. Age gating will not make unsafe products safe. Bans could well create more risk for those children who still use those platforms because they will remove the incentives to ensure that robust child safety features for young users who evade the age assurance measures. Bans will not improve those products that children will still be allowed to use. What is the problem here? The fact that we are letting billion-dollar companies market unsafe digital products in Australia? Or is it the fact that some of those Australians are children and teenagers? There are much less restrictive alternatives available which could achieve the aim of protecting children and young people from online harms. An appropriate starting point to better protect child rights online would be implementation of the Privacy Act review and the Online Safety Act review. Both of these look to tackle concerns linked to the digital environment pragmatically rather than prohibitively. To that end, yesterday I supported the member for Goldstein's private member's bill for a digital duty of care. Her proposal to amend the Online Safety Act to impose an overarching standard of care for large providers would mandate risk assessments and risk mitigation plans, mandatory transparency reporting and stringent enforcement mechanisms. It would require the platforms to take reasonable steps to make their products safe for children and young people. It would improve online safety for everybody. Other measures to improve online safety could include regulating to limit notifications, autoplay, low default privacy settings, weak age gating for adult products, and the infinite scroll feature, which is designed to promote user engagement. We need to also help children and young people better navigate online spaces by ensuring that the national curriculum includes a specific focus on digital literacy and online safety. Young people should be taught to think critically about what they see online and how they engage with social media. Parents and teachers also need better tools and resources to help them provide appropriate guidance and support. This work will take time and effort, the sort of time and effort that the government has not put into this legislation. But that time and that effort would be worthwhile. Speaker, we all know and we acknowledge that social media carries significant risks for children and young people. As a parent, as a paediatrician, as a politician, I know that those risks need to be addressed by this government. We do have a duty of care to make changes in this important area carefully, judiciously, but with a mind always to the rights and the needs of young people. In this last sitting week of 2024, with no apparent cause and no rational justification for their unseemly haste, both major political parties in Australia are rushing to ban social media for young people. Their proposals are broad in scope, but they are short on detail. They abdicate all responsibility for the program to digital providers. They are not evidence-based. They risk being ineffectual and they risk potentially significant unintended consequences. and they will drive cynicism from young Australians who see that this government hasn't got the bottle to take on online gambling advertising, but is happy to rush through this legislation without appropriate consultation or thought. Systemic regulation will drive up safety and privacy standards on all platforms for all children. This approach is supported by the experts in mental health, digital literacy and child psychology. This approach will protect our children. Age assurance is rife with privacy and digital security risks. It's rife with critical effectiveness and implementation issues. It is not a cure-all safeguard for children and their data protection. It could well increase risk for young Australians in the digital space. Deputy Speaker, something worth doing is worth doing properly, carefully, judiciously and in an evidence-based way. We have a duty to protect the best interests of all Australians, but most particularly our young and our vulnerable. This bill will not do that, and for that reason I cannot commend this legislation to the House.
I thank the honourable member for the contribution, and the question before the House is that the amendments before the House now be agreed to. And with that, I give the call to the most honourable member for Quorum.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by highlighting what the Coalition has negotiated when it comes to this bill. And it's negotiated some incredibly important amendments which we expect to see reflected as amendments in the Senate debate. And these were important changes, and they're changes which all members in this House should note. And in our view, they have significantly strengthened this planned piece of legislation. Now, the first area where we have improved this legislation is in relation to privacy. And I can't be clearer as to how important this is. There will be new provisions stating that people cannot be compelled to provide digital ID. Now, that's worth repeating. People cannot be compelled to provide digital ID, and they cannot be compelled to provide government-issued identity documents, such as a driver's licence or a passport. So under this legislation, you cannot be compelled to provide a driver's licence or a passport, and you cannot be compelled to provide digital ID. Full stop, period. That is what the legislation will say when it is amended in the Senate. Secondly, following our discussions with the government, changes will be made so that the Communications Minister, the Minister, will be able to make rules specifying actions that social media platforms are not required to take in order to comply with the legislation. So the Minister can make sure that they can set rules that will dictate to the social media platforms about the things that they do not have to undertake. And this means that these rules and the person who governs these rules will not be the e-Safety Commissioner, it will be the Minister. So the Minister can be held account by the Australian people, and if the Minister doesn't do the right thing and doesn't instruct the social media platforms accordingly, then we have a way to deal with that. And the way we can deal with that is that there will be an election. And if the Minister cannot justify what they've done, then the Minister obviously will be held to account by the Australian people. Now, these are incredibly important changes, and they're incredibly important changes to an issue which is incredibly important. And it's one that goes back a long way. It's not like that we've come to this chamber today dealing with this issue for the first time. When I was Education Minister, now some 6 or 7 years ago, Jonathan Haidt from the US a well-known and regarded professor came to this country detailing the issues that he was already starting to see that social media was having on young people. And he started talking about the harm that it was causing, and in particular, the mental health issues, the anxiety, the depression, the bullying, and all sorts of other issues that the impact of social media was having on young people's minds. And the statistics then were staggering. And they were so staggering, it led me to push at an Education Council ministers' meeting with all the state and territories for them to ban phones at schools. Now, sadly, it took many years after that for that to occur. But even then, the data was so compelling that it became obvious that we had to start taking action to protect children. Now, the fact that we've got here where we are today is because of the evidence base that has been presented about the harm that is being caused. And we've seen it in newspaper articles in the last 5 to 6 years or more, whether it be with regards to the impact that bullying has had, whether it is the impact that we've seen with regards to youth suicide, young people sadly taking their lives, whether it's the impact that we've seen through eating disorders, whether it's the impact that we've seen through anxiety. Through all these things, we've seen that there is harm being caused. And the question that we all have to answer is, why would you give people, young people under the age of 16, access to information, to sites that we prevent them from having in the real world? Why would we allow them a mechanism where they can see pornography, child pornography, at an age of 16 or below when you can't see that in the real world, when it's banned? Child pornography obviously banned, full stop, illegal. Pornography only available to those over 18, yet we're providing a mechanism for those under 16 to see it. Now, absolutely, parents have a role to play, but parents also need help and some guidance from lawmakers, from us, a lot of us who are parents. We have to play our role to support parents. Parenting is critical in this. Parenting has the primary role, but we help parents by saying, well, the law backs you in saying that your child, if they're under 16, shouldn't get access to social media. And let's not fool ourselves. The big social media companies can take the mechanisms, can put in place the mechanisms to be able to deal with this, and deal with it in a way that doesn't mean that you need to provide digital ID or government-sanctioned ID. We have the tools to be able to deal with this. And like any law, what we need to do also is to be able to assess its impact over time, modify and change it over time, like we do with all laws. And that is what this will enable us to do as well. We will be able to have committees look at it. We'll be able to have further advice given to us as legislators, and we'll be able to continue to take steps to keep children safe, to make sure that we're doing everything we can to stop the bullying, to stop the eating disorders, to basically make sure that young kids aren't getting access to gambling, to pornography, that they shouldn't be getting access to. Now, will it be perfect? No. But is any law perfect? No, it's not. But if it helps, even if it helps in just the smallest of ways, it will make a huge difference to people's lives. And it will make a huge difference to the lives of families, to parents in how they're parenting their children, because if they're able to say, well, the law is on our side, it will help them to be able to enforce the guidance that they want to be able to give their children. Now, Deputy Speaker, while we're on the subject of the large social media platforms, I want to be able to talk about the impact that it's having more broadly on society. And more broadly on society, in particular when it comes to how news is generated in this country. Last week, we had the very, very sad news that the Hamilton Spectator, Portland Observer and Cassidy News will be closing down. Now, to give you a sense of the history that we are losing in Western Victoria as a result of this, the Hamilton Spectator was first published in 1859. I think it is, or is definitely one of, the longest-running newspapers in this country. Now, there are many reasons why it is closing, and my hope is that someone might still come along and purchase it. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Bexes, Richard and Nola, for everything they've done to make sure that the newspapers, since their first time in taking over the Hamilton Spectator, which was in 1985, have been the distinguished newspapers that they are. Now, as we all know in this place, newspapers sometimes give us as MPs a good, positive run. At other times, they'll ask us serious questions about why we've voted this way or that way. But I have always found the Hamilton Spectator, the Cassidy News and the Portland Observer to have absolute integrity in the way they've gone about their journalism, to do the best they possibly could to make sure they advocated on behalf of the local communities and to ensure that the community had a voice. And I want to thank the Bexes, and can I take this opportunity in particular to thank Richard Bex for his stewardship of these newspapers and all the journalists that have worked for the newspapers over a long period of time. You know, I was in Cassidy recently. They were hit by a huge, huge hailstorm. And who was there but the local journalist, making sure that she was ensuring that the reporting on what was happening was accurate and that the community was being heard. Thank you, Christy. The Hamilton Spec has always done that on behalf of their community, and the Portland Observer as well. I was in Portland recently with the head of Alcoa. Wonderful, wonderful reporting again on what is happening out at the smelter. Incredibly important business for Portland and its future, in the same way that the Spec has done it year in, year out, for all that time, dating back, as I said, to 1859. Thank you to the Bexes for what you've done. Thank you to all those journalists who have worked for those three newspapers over this long and distinguished period. It is a sad day for our community, and as I've said, my hope is that someone might step in and purchase them so that that community presence that those newspapers represent can continue.
Yeah. The Minister.
I move that the debate on this bill be adjourned to a later hour this day.
The question is that the debate be adjourned and the resumption of the debate be made in order of the day for later hour this day. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. For the benefit of the member for Brisbane, we've just got some ledge come back from the Fed. We'll deal with them and then we'll come straight back to you. I have to report that the surveillance legislation confirmation of application bill for 2024 has been fully considered by the Federation Chamber and has been agreed to without amendment. With an amendment, I present the certified copy of the bill together with a schedule of the amendment by the Federation Chamber. I understand it's the wish of the House to consider the bill immediately. So the question is that the amendment made by the Federation Chamber be agreed to. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. So the question is now that the bill, as amended, be agreed to. I'll put that question. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The bill, as amended, has been agreed to. Minister?
I ask leave of the House to move the third reading immediately.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
I move that this bill be now read a third time.
Thank the Minister. Call the clerk. I'll put that question. All that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. I'll call the clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to confirm the application of surveillance device and related legislation and for related purposes.
I have to report to the Commonwealth Entities Payment Surcharges Bill of 2024. It's been fully considered by the Federation Chamber and it's been agreed to without amendment, and I present a certified copy of the bill. Question is, I thank the clerk. The question is that the bill now be agreed to. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. It'd be helpful if we had a second aye. Get in, you. Well done. I'll put that question. It's been agreed to. The bill has now been agreed. The bill has now been agreed to. The Minister.
I ask leave of the House to move the third reading immediately.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
Well done.
I move that this bill be now read a third time.
I'll put that question. All that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to authorise Commonwealth entities to charge and collect payment surcharges and for related purposes.
I have to report that the Commonwealth Entities Payment Surcharge Tax Imposition Bill of 2024 has been fully considered by the Federation Chamber and has been agreed to without amendment. I present a certified copy of the bill. Well done. The question is now that this bill be agreed to. All of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The bill's now being agreed to. The Minister.
I ask leave of the House to move the third reading immediately.
Is leave granted?
Is granted.
I move that this bill be now read a third time.
I'll put that question. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think that ayes have it. The clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to impose a tax relating to payment surcharges and for related purposes.
Last one, I have to report to the Commonwealth Entities Payment Surcharges, Consequential Provisions and Other Matters Bill of 2024 has been fully considered by the Federation Chamber and has been agreed to without amendment, and I present a certified copy of the bill. Thank you, mate. The question is now that the bill be agreed to. All that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The bill has been agreed to. The Minister.
I ask leave of the House to move the third reading immediately.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
I thank the Minister. I give the call to the Minister.
Thank you. I move that this bill be now read a third time.
I'll put that question. All of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to deal with consequential matters arising from the enactment of the Commonwealth Entities Payment Surcharges Act 2024 and with certain payment surcharges and for related purposes.
I thank the clerk, and we're going to go back now. I thank the room for the members for their consideration. The question now before the House is that the amendments before the House be agreed to, and with that I give the call to the most honourable member for Brisbane. I will call the clerk first before we do that, apparently.
Government business, order of the day number 5, Online Safety Amendment, Social Media Minimum Age Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by the member for Goldstein to the amendment moved by the member for McKellar to the amendment moved by the member for North Sydney.
Thank the clerk. as we had adjourned, that we had to reintroduce that bit of ledge back to the House, and the call now is given to the honourable member for Brisbane that the amendments be agreed to.
I hope this speech is worth the wait.
Well done. Thank you for all your consideration.
Prohibition doesn't work. Prohibition is not how you make social media platforms safer or empower young Australians to navigate the online world in a safe way. This bill is not going to resolve the root causes of online harm. It's simply just not going to work. All of us want to see more accountability for social media platforms and greater transparency for users, but this bill provides neither. And let's not forget how rushed this process has been. The government allowed for a consultation period on the bill for just 24 hours. The Senate hearing for the bill was just 3 hours, and young people were essentially locked out from having their voices heard because of this process. We absolutely need to protect young people online, especially the targeting, harvesting, and selling of their data. A blanket ban, though, is not the way to do it. The recent parliamentary inquiry into social media heard over and over that an age ban will not make social media safer for anyone. It's complicated to implement. It will have unintended consequences for young people as well. Yet here we are again, with the government and the coalition teaming up, ignoring the evidence and ramming this bill through in the final sitting week of the year. So why won't it work? Well, this bill inserts a new definition of age-restricted social media platforms, which effectively puts a blanket ban on all social media platforms. The government has indicated that some platforms will be exempt, but again, we don't have the detail before us that we need to properly scrutinise this legislation. Leaving exemptions to regulations puts a lot of trust in the follow-through, and I'm not confident that it's going to be done effectively. Now, the government themselves acknowledge that this is not a perfect system. The Prime Minister has said that, quote, "We know some kids will find workarounds, but we're sending a message to social media companies to clean up their act," end quote. The reality is that many kids, not just some, many young people, will find a way to access these platforms anyway, and social media companies don't actually have to change anything about how they apply their algorithms as a result of this bill. Now, the bill also doesn't prescribe how platforms will monitor and enforce an age ban. We expect this will require some sort of age assurance, not just for young people, but for everyone. The government already announced funding for an age assurance trial in the budget, but has only just awarded the tender. So essentially, the trial on a fundamental aspect of this bill has not even started yet. The idea of sharing important data with these platforms, whose profit model is built on selling data profiles to advertisers, is a very popular idea among not just young people, but across my entire community. And let's not pretend young people aren't going to find a way to access these platforms. They are smart. They will figure it out. I actually think of a time when I was 13 and I would come home from school and spend too much time playing on my computer and I wouldn't finish my homework. And my dad installed a timing program on my computer that it would switch off after an hour so I couldn't play The Sims for too long. It took me 10 minutes to figure out how to get around that. The answer there was working with me to do my homework, not just banning the game that I was using. So a blanket ban on social media also runs the risk of driving young people into even less safe online spaces. When that happens, it becomes impossible to know what is going on and how to help those who need help when something goes wrong. Now, many young people can have positive online experiences as well. Young people get a lot of good information and valuable social networks and support from social media, especially isolated young people or young people from marginalised backgrounds who may rely on it for their social contact. Why punish young people for the inaction of publishers and tech companies? This ban will create an Australia that says young people can go to prison at the age of 10 but can't go on Instagram until they are 16. So what should we be doing? Now, experts are actively calling for alternative solutions to address the root causes of the problems of online safety, regulating the platforms themselves. The government has committed to legislating a duty of care, but that is not a part of this legislation. If the government can rush these laws through, why can't they implement the duty of care they promised, or take measures that actually make platforms safer for everyone, like banning platforms from collecting, selling and exploiting young people's data? Now, the EU has a Digital Services Act, which has a number of protections for young people, including banning the use of profiling for ads on children and implementing obligations for children's safety that providers must abide by. There are practical solutions here that we should be looking at. That ban on the targeting, harvesting and selling of young people's data, a digital duty of care platform, EU-style guardrails to limit the toxicity of algorithms and extreme content, the ability for users to turn down and opt out of unwanted content, the full release of the Online Safety Act review, and investment in education for young people and their families to help develop digital literacy and online safety skills and equip them with the tools and resources they need for positive and responsible online use. These actions would help tackle the root issues of social media. This is what we should be doing, not legislating a ban on access with the seemingly expectation that everything is magically okay online the second you turn 16. An age ban alone will not make the platform safer or age-appropriate, nor will it change the culture that informs unsafe behaviours that people are targeted with on these platforms. Instead of banning young people altogether, we need to tackle the predatory business models of the tech giants. That includes the algorithms that fuel extremism and mental health issues. The government's own online safety expert, the e-Safety Commissioner, has recommended a multi-pronged approach that encourages platforms to be safe by design. Australia's Human Rights Commissioner has voiced concerns about these restrictions in the legislation and the rushed timeframe of this legislation as well. If the government wants to protect the safety of young people, they should be looking to stop platforms harvesting young people's data and targeting them with algorithms and advertising to make massive profits. All users should have the ability to switch off, reset, or turn down the algorithms that push unwanted content into their feed. Privacy reforms are also long overdue. The protection of all users' data is vital to keeping people safer on and offline. There is growing concern about the unabated use of users' data by tech companies to train their AIs without consent, knowledge, or compensation. In the EU, the likes of Meta have been forced to provide an opt-out option for users at a minimum. Australia must force companies to do the same here, because prohibition doesn't work. It hasn't before, and it won't now or into the future. If we are serious about addressing the issues that have arisen because of social media, then we must tackle them at the source. Guardrails, digital duties of care, stopping the targeting and harvesting of young people's data, all of these are far better approaches than a blanket ban. Young people will find ways around a ban, and then what? We may create a situation where young people are driven into even worse online spaces, and that is something that nobody wants. As the youngest person in this chamber and one of very, very few people in this place who grew up with this technology and with social media, I can say that change is needed, but this bill is not it. It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how the internet works and how young people engage with the internet. So my message to the government is this: bin this bill, talk to young people and come back. Young people are painfully aware of how algorithms work and how they impact themselves and their social circles. Listen to young people, listen to the experts. You would come back with a much better bill.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I know we all worry about what kids are exposed to on the internet. Extreme content is everywhere, online bullying is worsening, and kids can gamble with the click of a button. I get it. I'm a grandparent. I want to protect my grandchildren too, and I understand why so many people would think a social media ban would be a good idea. We all want to protect our kids, to shield them from harm, to keep them safe from the dangers of the world for as long as we possibly can. It's natural. The internet is a wild and often unregulated place. We feel we have very little control about what our children see or do online. But the unfortunate reality of this flawed bill is that it won't actually do that. It won't protect our kids. It likely won't even stop them from using these platforms or seeing the harmful content we so desperately want to shield them from. What it will do, dangerously, is create the illusion of action while not addressing the real dangers of the online world. I know many parents want something, anything to be done, but this bill is just not the solution. This bill shifts the blame. Instead of holding billion-dollar tech giants accountable for their harmful practices, it targets kids and families. It says to parents, you figure it out, while these corporations keep profiting off the harm that they do. Because banning young people from these platforms doesn't stop them from accessing harmful content. It doesn't stop tech giants from exploiting their data and pushing toxic algorithms, and it certainly doesn't fix the root problem. The government claims this legislation is world-leading. Yeah, but embarrassingly, what it is leading the world in is poorly thought-through legislation. It is leading the world in legislation uninformed by evidence. It is leading the world in legislation so riddled with privacy and safety risks that it'll likely do more harm than good. The minister herself seemed underwhelmed by her own legislation when trying to defend it in a response to a question in question time this week. The Joint Committee inquiry into social media heard months of evidence from experts, from parents, from young people and organisations, and their overwhelming majority recommendation not to impose an age ban. Other countries have tried similar measures and they've failed abysmally. South Korea, for instance, rolled back their shutdown law in 2021 because it simply did not work. The government's response? Ignore the experts, the months of evidence, and instead rely on a 16-page evaluation report by the Office of Impact Analysis, a report widely criticised as thin on evidence. It even cites a study that doesn't support banning children under 16. In fact, the study's co-author has publicly stated that the government has misunderstood the findings. Completely unsurprising from a government that has made a name for itself comprehensively misunderstanding the real needs of everyday Australians, hanging them out to dry while corporations are continuously let off the hook. This proposed fix to online harms for young people is just more of the same. I've heard from many Ryan parents who, of course, want their kids to be safe online. We all do. But they know, as do the experts, that banning kids from social media is not the answer. Kids are smart. They're smarter than most of us in this place when it comes to navigating social media. They'll find ways around these bans. Not to mention, one of the most glaring issues with this bill is privacy. While the legislation prohibits platforms from using data collected for age verification for other purposes, it doesn't change the fact that it requires young people and everyone else to share sensitive information with platforms that have a long history, a bad history of exploiting user data for their own profit. Really, who trusts social media companies with their data? Really? Few do, and for very good reason. Platforms like Facebook have repeatedly shown that they will prioritise profit over privacy, often at the expense of their most vulnerable users. Yet, Labor proposes we hand them more of our personal information. It's insanity. Prohibition isn't safe. Prohibition is a band-aid that fails to address the fundamental problem, which is the toxic business models of tech giants. These platforms profit from harmful algorithms that push extreme content, exploit personal data, and target young people with predatory advertising. It's their business model. Experts have made it clear that these are the root causes of online harm. The government has promised exemptions for services like Headspace, Kids Helpline and Google Classroom, but these exemptions rely on future regulations. They're not even in this bill. If those regulations aren't passed in time, or if a new government chooses not to follow through, kids could lose access to online spaces designed to actually help them and educate them. The loopholes in this bill are just so huge you could drive a truck through them. Kids will always find workarounds. The Prime Minister has already admitted as much, so what are we really achieving here? We're not protecting kids. We're driving them towards less regulated, more dangerous corners of the internet. And what about the unintended consequences for young people's mental health and well-being? Cutting them off from social media doesn't eliminate the challenges they face. It isolates them from their peers and their communities and vital support networks. Online spaces can be dangerous, but they can also be lifelines. Rather than banning young people from these platforms, we should be empowering them with the tools to navigate these spaces safely and confidently. We need education. The government should fund programs that teach digital literacy and online safety skills to young people and their families. Prohibition doesn't teach kids how to be safe online. It just sort of pushes the problem out of sight. Social media platforms have become breeding grounds for harmful content, predatory advertising and unsafe practices. This flawed bill doesn't solve those problems. It's being rushed through and its consequences will be far-reaching and deeply harmful, not just for young people, but for everyone who uses the internet. Thank you.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on this government's online safety amendment, Social Media Minimum Age Bill 2024. And while I accept that there is a goal of dealing with online harms and protecting young people, I think this is incredibly misguided and it is a window-dressing attempt by the government to look like it is doing something about harm without actually doing anything that is going to be meaningful. I'm concerned this legislation will backfire by driving underground the harms of social media and, in fact, not preventing ultimately how young people will access social media and they will find their way. But what it will do is fail to hold social media companies accountable for moderating harmful content, which will still proliferate on these platforms. The potential dangers of social media are undeniable. We're all concerned. I think we've all in this place been exposed to the dark and the black hole of negativity that can exist there. The anonymity of people dealing through social media, thinking that it's a platform on which they can say and behave in the most atrocious way. But that doesn't get solved by just banning young people under 16 from these platforms. That gets solved by imposing a duty of care on these platforms, making them responsible for harmful content. And that is where the government should be stepping up to the plate and actually do what is maybe hard but necessary to be done if you want to be a government that is taken seriously on protecting young people and all users from harm. There's no doubt we need to get the balance right, and of course protecting children is so important. But we have to. But let's get real for the average age of this place, right? We are in a whole different age category. Young people have grown up online. For many, social media is not just a pastime, it's an important communications tool that connects them with their peers and wider community. And it's been really interesting to listen to some of the justifications by members of government to talk about, and the Prime Minister has done it, talking about how we want to see the kids back on the footy field and playing and all of those things. Of course we want them to be active. But the suggestion that somehow banning social media is going to immediately result in this uptick of physical activity or social interaction without additional measures or any real research in how that's even going to happen is just taking Australians for fools, I think, in how this legislation's been drafted and presented and the time in which it's been put forward. Because what we also know is young people find their community through social media, and it's been fascinating for me as a mum of young adults now, but watching them online and being concerned about the harms and the influence, but also then observing the benefits, seeing how through certain mediums they've had the opportunity to find their peers, find their tribe, feel connected. And they are all the things that are at risk of being lost. Young people don't just access services through, and what the Minister has indicated will be some exceptions, they actually also access information and services through their peers, through friends, relaying their experiences, and that will all be lost. Now, I don't dispute there is a dark side to the internet, to social media, that urgently needs to be addressed. But we also need to be really clear. Young people tell me about the positive ways they engage on these platforms. They build their communities, they explore creativity, they start businesses, they learn, they get an opportunity to see beyond the boundaries of just the national issues or like legacy media's take on events, and they can connect with young people all over the world. This is something that has been unique to their generation. And we know, of course, it also allows them to stay connected with families and friends. I think, anyone like grandparents, how do you stay connected with a young person? Actually, through social media, it gives you a window into their world that you don't have in any other way. So sadly, the government is not respecting the voice of young people here, and I think it's telling to see just how little that's really being reflected in the government speeches. And instead, it is people in this place imposing their will on young people. Rather than representing them, they are imposing their will on them. It's a blunt policy tool that punishes ultimately young people while letting perpetrators of harmful content and the platforms that host it completely off the hook. The bill seeks to restrict users under the age of 16 from having a social media account by relying on social media companies to take reasonable steps for the age assurance of their users. Well, and in all my queries to the Minister and the government of what are those reasonable steps and how will this age assurance process work, they don't know. This is a complete unknown. It is completely putting the horse before the cart when it comes to, the cart before the horse, in terms of this legislation. The government has no idea how this is going to work, and yet it is taking up vulnerable time. The bill's intention, well-meaning, as I say, it acknowledges very real harm of online platforms, and I have got concerns about that. But the effectiveness of this bill is highly in doubt, and there are serious concerns about unintended consequences to this bill. So I do seek to move the amendment circulated in my name that seeks to adjourn the debate in relation to this bill, that it should not be rushed through this parliament the way it has been. We should have a comprehensive understanding of how these measures can be implemented and the unintended consequences to the legislation. We know that the government has just awarded a tender for the age assurance trial, which will inform advice of the implementation and enforcement of the ban to the government and the e-Safety Commissioner. I ask the government to not call a vote on the second reading speech until a final report with the results of the age assurance trial has been presented to Parliament so that parents and users can be informed. The government is being selective on the harms that it wishes to protect young people from, and it is prioritising a blunt social media ban over protecting young people from the harm of many real things such as gambling advertising and the algorithm and how it works. Gambling advertising poses a significant concern for young people, and its well-documented links to increased gambling participation. So the government is absolutely being selective about which harm it's choosing to prioritise. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's when the government was under the pump about introducing a ban on gambling advertising that all of a sudden we get the posturing and the big announcement around an age ban, online ban. The ban on gambling advertising was unanimously recommended by a multi-partisan committee following an in-depth inquiry into the harms of gambling. The government has accepted that recommendation and yet to date refused to take action. So on top of this, we know that polling shows over 70% of Australians want a ban on gambling advertising. So if you want to win the favour of voters, act on banning gambling advertising. The message couldn't be any clearer. Instead, the government is focusing on a minimum age bill, which was originally drafted, as I said, just in September. It's a distraction to that promise to ban gambling advertising, and it ultimately won't be implemented until 2026. So why is this being rushed without proper scrutiny, with only a couple of days in this parliament? This is bad government, bad governance. When the bill was introduced last week, it was the first time we were even able to read and understand the details of the proposed legislation. And now, in the last week of Parliament, the government's expediting this bill, limiting the availability of parliamentary scrutiny and oversight over its effect. We have serious concerns around privacy consequences, and ultimately this bill will impact all users. It's not just the under-16s that will be banned. all users of social media will, to some extent, have to be assessed by those platforms as to whether or not they fall foul of it. What we know is that this bill requires much more scrutiny. Last week, the bill was sent to Senate Committee on Environment and Communications, and the committee only accepted submissions for 24 hours. I mean, if that is not a joke when it comes to public consultation, I don't know what more could be said. In that time, the inquiry was inundated with over 15,000 submissions. Clearly, the public feels strongly about this issue. Even more reason the bill should be subjected to proper scrutiny. Only yesterday morning were the committee able to hear from the community on wide-ranging impacts of the bill, and the committee will publish their recommendations today, but here we are debating and being asked to shortly vote on it. And this is all only 5 days after the bill was sent to committee. Now, the government has even acknowledged that this is a short-term approach to protect young people whilst they continue to work on longer-term solutions for protecting people from harms online. Well, the member for Goldstein has already put to the Parliament tabling a private member's bill that addresses much of those harms. So, if the government is not capable of coming up with proper legislation, adopt the work the member for Goldstein has done, and let's get on with a real protection of people online through a duty of care. There's no details from the government about any of their plans to legislate further protections. It's a bit of a trust me, we've got this, we'll get to this. But all we've got is this band-aid solution of just imposing a ban on under-16s. If the government was serious about safeguarding young people from harms online, they could have introduced a temporary ban or fast-tracked to implement a statutory duty of care for online platforms, start dealing with bots online, start dealing with anonymous accounts, force some accountability and some monitoring of harm, do something about the algorithm. So I ask the government why it's prioritising this legislation to rush through Parliament, knowing that it won't be implemented for time, it doesn't even have a proper process. In contrast, gambling advertising is something that needs to be done. Now, when we talk about harm from online platforms, we know it's ever-present, and certain groups, such as children and young teenagers, are at greater risk of this harm. Young people more than ever are feeling isolated and excluded, and some teenagers do use social media platforms, have regularly reported, some find lower life satisfaction than those who don't use online platforms. But we also know that others who feel isolated find their tribe and find great comfort out of social media as well. We know that online platforms enable young people to endure cyberbullying, hate speech, online abuse, as well as harmful content. All these potential harms are not to be understated and create a real and ongoing threat to their mental health. And I agree that online platforms must be made to be responsible to keep everyone safe on their platforms. They should be forced to promote respectful, honest, authentic content. A responsibility these platforms often fail to do. But nothing about this proposal does this. The blanket ban on social media is not the answer. In fact, the Butterfly Foundation, who represent Australians impacted by eating disorders and body image issues, they've stated that a blanket ban takes the onus off platforms to do better and could negatively impact people looking for help who are socially and physically isolated. Restricting access to under 16, the government has neglected the opportunity to regulate platforms to materially improve online safety for everyone. And so I really ask the government to do better. Surely you can do better than this, than trying to just grab a headline of just, trying to look like you're doing something about online when really you're not. I appreciate that for young parents this is incredibly distressing, and it's easy to think that banning it will be the solution. The reality is it's just going to push it underground. It's still going to happen. I've got a modern family of 5, they're all adults now, but I know how tech savvy they are, what they do. And for me, legislation that would allow them to reset their default settings, to make sure the algorithms are much safer, that there is a responsibility and a duty of care. These are all things that would make a difference. Of course, we also need greater education. How young people and all users need to understand how to be safer and more responsible digital citizens. This is an important piece of the puzzle to keep young people safe. And instead, but of course, the government is not focusing on that. What could actually be done that would be... I think of where kids have found their tribe online. For example, schools strike for climate. Young people's lives have been online, and social media has played an important role in amplifying young people's voices on who they and they may otherwise have been excluded, and their voice was not reflected in mainstream media. For example, Lucy Flynn is a 14-year-old from my electorate who, after recovering from an eating disorder, she decided to make her own petition to call on the government to provide more public hospital beds for treatment of those with eating disorders. She harnessed the power of social media to tell her story and amplify the issues in eating disorder funding. So online platforms can provide a platform to reach people outside their geographical communities, provide an avenue for youth leadership on issues that matter to them, and for the ability for young people to feel that they have control over their future. When I think that the government doesn't even want to be saddled with a duty of care to young people when it comes to the environment, and now they want to take away their capacity to mobilise and to have a voice when it comes to climate issues. School strikes for climate is a classic example where thousands of young people came together to march and require the environment to march on the Environmental Minister's office and demand real and substantive climate action. This provided an invaluable opportunity for young people to have a voice and heard in a way.
The member's time has expired. Is the amendment seconded? Is the amendment seconded?
Deputy Speaker, I second the member for Warringah's amendment and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for North Sydney moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted, with a view to substituting other words. The honourable member for Mackellar has moved as an amendment to that amendment that all words after house be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The honourable member for Warringah has now moved a further amendment, and the question now is that the amendment moved by the honourable member for Warringah be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This legislation is a band-aid to fix a wicked problem. It's neither the systemic nor structural reform the Australian public needs. I can well understand why parents like it, and I especially acknowledge those parents who've lost children attributed to social media harm, including those who testified bravely and powerfully to the Select Committee on Social Media and Australian Society, which I was a member of. I also acknowledge Rob Evans, father of Liv, who I've spoken of before in this chamber. Liv took her own life due to an eating disorder, and social media was a contributor. I convened a working group on eating disorders and social media, which in many ways has been the genesis of my policy work in this space, and I think has also captured the government's attention in a positive way. And I absolutely acknowledge the connection between various harms and social media. So I don't deny that something needs to be done. The platforms have powerful underlying systems that actively and knowingly influence kids' social lives, play kingmaker in online public debates, and run a data free-for-all in the name of advertising. And it's self-evident that these platforms are motivated by profit, not community benefit or safety. However, my issue is that this legislation will make zero difference to the harms that are inherent to social media. It will not force the platforms to manage their algorithms. It will not force the platforms to identify and manage risk, nor force transparency. So what to do? Social media gives us many great rewards: connection, information, business opportunities, opens up the world. For young people, it's a social space. The 2020s equivalent of sitting on the landline phone on the hallway floor for hours, as I did in the 1980s. It's a source of mental health support for many. And University of Canberra research shows that it's where the vast majority of young people get their news and current affairs. But the sheer scale of the risk it concurrently poses to individuals and our society demands a regulatory response that is proportionate in urgency and in ambitious. This is particularly the case given the power of the social media proprietors who've operated and grown their platforms largely uncontrolled until now. Additionally, in Australia, they operate under a toothless self-regulation model and place the bulk of their profits and management offshore, out of reach of Australian tax and legal systems. As a member of the Joint Select Committee on Social Media and Australian Society, it's fair to say that I've been thinking about all of this a lot of late. The committee had a wide remit, but took substantial evidence regarding age assurance. Certainly there were opinions that it was a good idea, but there was no substantive evidence-based expert testimony that stacked up if or how it would actually work. One of the recommendations the committee did agree to in its final report was that the government report the results of its age assurance trial to the Parliament. The trial is only just underway and it won't be complete for at least 6 to 12 months. Meanwhile, we're debating, and presumably the Parliament will be passing this legislation blindly because the idea is somewhat popular. Worse, it potentially allows big tech to tick a box without actually doing much at all. And what that even is unknown. The bill that was introduced just last week and sent to committee for one day, despite more than 15,000 submissions, contains no provisions on how the platforms are to keep the kids out. They're expected to take reasonable steps. What those are will be worked out by the platforms with regulatory input from the minister later. It's backwards. And in many ways, this is policy that is also looking back to a bygone era, when we all played street cricket until dusk instead of looking at our phones, and found out where our friends were by riding around the neighbourhood until we found the house where all the Malvern stars were lying on the front lawn. I get it. We all want that life back for our kids. But our societies have become digitised over the last 2.5 decades. The entrenchment of digital communications platforms and technologies has been gradual, but it is enduring. We cannot look back to the technological challenges and solutions of last century and apply them to our contemporary context, such as the Online Safety Act does and age-gating social media would. This mindset cannot continue to guide contemporary Australian policy-making. It is time to think forward, not back. In my engagement with the Goldstein community on this legislation, the feedback has been varied. I've heard from some, and as a parent I understand, the uncertainty and feeling of lack of control over what our children can be exposed to online. These parents observe their children taking to the intentionally addictive qualities of social media and digital platforms, and I deeply understand the desire to solve this problem. I, like these Goldstein parents, wish that this legislation was the silver bullet we wish for that would comprehensively protect our kids from online harm. If it was, I would be its strongest advocate. But unfortunately, this legislation is nowhere close to what's needed to meaningfully protect our kids in their online experiences. The true objective of this legislation is not to make social media safe by design, but to make parents and voters feel like the government is doing something about it. There's a reason why the government parades this legislation as world-leading. That's because no other country wants to do it, and for good reason. Modern policy problems require modern solutions, and obviously solutions that will actually work. Of all of the many pitfalls in this legislation, at the core of arguments put forward by those who oppose it is this: age-gating is quite simply not the appropriate mechanism to use in this context. In fact, there is little evidence at all to suggest that an age-based regime of this nature could be effective. Instead of protecting our children from social media, it may also expose them and possibly Australia's adult population to additional risk. The bill does not specify how digital platforms will be expected to verify an individual's age, leaving open the possibility that Australians of various ages may be forced to hand over sensitive personal information to keep their accounts. I note the opposition amendments apparently negotiated with the government on limiting the requirements to hand over things like passport details, and this is a good step. But according to Digital Rights Watch, the information required might still range from birth dates all the way to face prints. I note that the legislation mandates the destruction of such information, but as so many Australians deeply understand, our nation doesn't have a strong track record of late in protecting the privacy of our citizens. I note the member for Mayo's consideration in detail amendment in relation to the provision of personal information, which I will support. It would be remiss of me, Deputy Speaker, not to point out the stunning irony of the Coalition's sudden reluctance to support this legislation following a tweet by one of big tech's oligarchs, Elon Musk. Misinformation spreading online sought to make the curious link between this legislation and the government's digital ID bill, both as part of a conspiracy to shut down free speech on the internet. This bill, one that ostensibly claims to challenge the awesome and concentrated power of big tech, was close to the chopping block via a simple tweet sent from those who stand to be regulated by it. Go figure. Perhaps this is more, though, than simple irony. Perhaps this is a testament to the disproportionate political and cultural power big tech have been allowed to accumulate, and the set of circumstances which have led us to this point. To the point of debating legislation which even the Prime Minister himself describes as potentially unenforceable. The power of the platforms and the importance of making them accountable leads me to what we could be doing, should be doing instead. Something that's actually meaningful and will stand the test of time. The government had lots of policy options to choose from here. One only needs to look overseas to see online safety regulatory regimes that are working. But, on brand for this government, once again, their chosen policy was just the lowest hanging fruit, the path that is simple and political, not the one that will actually make social media safe for our children by design. Yesterday I tabled a private member's bill, a 5-pillar regime which amounts to a digital duty of care. If the government wants to make social media safe for not just children but everybody, then let's take that to a vote right now. This model of legislation has broad support across the Parliament and in Australian civil society. It is supported by organisations ranging from the Foundation for Social Health to the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education to the Human Rights Law Centre to Reset Tech Australia, among others. A fully implemented digital duty of care is what will make social media safe for all Australian kids and adults. Rigorous age verification technology may one day be a supplementary component of such a duty of care. But the age-gating model as proposed in this legislation alone will be starkly inadequate. This is why I move the second reading amendment circulated in my name. Australia was once a world leader in online safety regulation, and we can achieve the government's aim to reclaim that mantle, just not with this bill. Only with safety by design, a duty of care, risk management and mitigation, and a solid incentive to comply will we make the digital platforms safe for our kids, ourselves and our communities. Online safety regulation cannot truly be safe unless it's systemic. It is the systems that must be made to change, not the people. We need to reshape our vision of what online safety looks like and follow the models that are achieving meaningful behavioural change, namely the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act in Europe, that impose a duty of care on the companies to do no harm. And we won't achieve that by passing a bill that just makes us all feel better. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Is the amendment seconded?
I second the amendment and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you. The member for Curtin. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for North Sydney moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The honourable member for Mackellar has moved as an amendment to that amendment that all words after house be omitted with a view to substituting other words. And the honourable member for Goldstein has moved as an amendment to that amendment that all words after house be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the amendment moved by the honourable member for Goldstein to the amendment moved by the honourable member for North Sydney be agreed to. So, Sorry, in that order. To the amendment to the Goldstein. Thank you. All right, and I call the honourable member for Longman. That's right.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the social media minimum age bill before us today. Let me say from the outset, Deputy Speaker, I fully support the intent of this legislation, which is to protect our young people from the harms of online bullying, a scourge not only in our society but globally. I'm sick and tired of hearing of another teenager that has taken their life due to online bullying. I'm tired of watching grieving parents plead for action on this serious issue. It is a common belief amongst those of us who have the privilege of being elected to serve that our first duty is the protection of all Australians. Deputy Speaker, my issues with this legislation are, as I said, not around intent, but I do have a problem with the mechanics and the rushed manner it is being rammed through, I suspect for vote-grabbing reasons. Why else would you rush legislation through that doesn't take effect, if passed, until 2026? Could it be that there's an election in the first half of next year? The Leader of the Opposition first announced this coalition policy over 12 months ago, saying we would implement it within 100 days after the election, should we have the privilege of winning government. This government have latched on to the Leader of the Opposition's initiative, but as usual they have done the headline, vibe, whole thing, but haven't thought through the process. In contrast, the coalition has been methodically working through the many inevitable questions that arise from proposed legislation like this. So, should we win the election, a sensible, well-thought methodology that addresses all aspects of the bill, including keeping children safe, as well as parents, social media and device hardware suppliers' roles in this initiative, while also considering protecting Australian citizens' privacy. I was pleased to see that the government agreed to the Coalition's amendment where social media companies cannot force people to upload their digital ID, driver's licence, passport or other government-issued identification to verify their age. This is definitely a step in the right direction. However, I wasn't pleased to discover some of the proposed methodology to age verify users relies on social media companies effectively using data they accumulate on us all through algorithms and the like, determining that someone is under 16 from their posts, or they may have posted something as simple as having a 13th birthday party. The retort to this, of course, is that they already do it, which, by the way, I hate, Deputy Speaker, the fact that they collect all this data on us. But knowing and condoning and even being complicit in encouraging them to use AI to monitor and collect data on us, it's something that I simply cannot in good conscience support. There is also talk of using facial recognition software for age identification. Now, I know about this, but the thought that these companies are catching images with goodness knows what in the background doesn't inspire me with great confidence either. The other issue is that these social media companies can, and I suggest will, simply change algorithms so they begin to miss people's ages, as make no mistake, they will lose revenue and profits if this legislation passes through, as they will enjoy a smaller market and customer base. We haven't even spoken about the parents' roles in this. Why can't we legislate that the manufacturers of devices, that anyone under 16 has to be tethered to their parent's device through their Apple ID, family sharing, iCloud or other forms, so that the parents have the final say in what apps their kids can use? This also removes the financial incentives for social media platforms who, from what I can see, don't currently make the hardware that people use. Deputy Speaker, no solution is a silver bullet, and people always find ways around laws if they really want to. But that's no reason why governments should not pass laws intended to protect people. Otherwise, we might as well have no age limit restrictions on alcohol, tobacco, gambling or movies. We have these laws as we know most Australians are law-abiding citizens and will comply with the laws of the day. By having a legislated age restriction, it also gives parents the added ammunition to say to their kids when they are inevitably asked, nagged or begged to have a social media account, sorry, it's against the law. Sure, there's those that would say, well, that's weak parenting. But not all families or children are the same for a myriad of reasons, and governments must try to consider all family dynamics and personalities when they're legislating. knowing full well that we will never be able to appease everyone or receive everyone's approval, but we must attempt to address the concerns and needs of as many of the population as possible. Deputy Speaker, as a father of 4 and a grandfather of 5, I've got some boys, some girls, some over 16, some under 16. I've seen firsthand the trauma and harm that social media does to our youth. My personal observation has been that once people generally reach an age of 16, in the main, they have the emotional stability and maturity to make better decisions on what they put on social media and what they read on social media. There's exceptions both ways, of course, but this age seems pretty right for most. As I said at the beginning of my contribution, I absolutely support the intent of this bill in protecting and in some cases saving the lives of our young people, but I have reservations due to the rushed manner and the lack of detail or methodology that is currently proposed in enforcing the legislation should it become law. I believe that the lives and the mental health of our youth outweigh any possible implications around privacy. But I would much rather see this legislation be postponed until a full and proper process has been able to be completed where we can actually see the detail of how the ID process will be enforced. It is far too important to be rammed through willy-nilly to try and win a few votes.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Hinkler.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a piece of legislation on which I find myself torn in terms of taking a position. And for those who know me, that is pretty unusual. I can usually form a view pretty quickly and come to that point and make a decision. And I want to give you an example of some of the correspondence and calls and emails that my office has been getting, Mr Deputy Speaker, and this is only a very small selection. Don't ban kids from the ocean, teach them to swim. What is the rush to get this done? Is this a backdoor into the digital ID bill? Will it stop the bullying? Several callers have said they will close all digital accounts if they're asked to prove their identity. Parental rights should not be taken away. This is a decision for the parent, not the government. It will force everyone onto dodgy apps that don't have any moderation. Making people create a digital footprint increases the information being available to hackers. Many workplaces, small businesses, sporting groups, community groups have social media pages to engage with their members. This would be reduced if these bans come in. What are the consequences for parents who allow their children on social media? There is not enough information about this bill or how it will work. Will this put DV victims at risk if they are forced to have real name accounts? So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a small sample of what's come into my office, and I suspect many, many others, because people are concerned. And I absolutely recognise their concerns, and one of our roles as members of Parliament is to put their concerns on the record in regards to legislation like this.
Order, it being 7:30 p.m. I propose the question that the House do now adjourn, and I call the honourable member for Fowler.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Bonrick High School Parents and Citizens Association wrote to me last week expressing their deep concern over the ongoing infrastructure crisis at their schools. Bonrick High is a wonderful pillar of my electorate of Fowler. Built in 1961, the school has not received significant infrastructure funding in decades. The school was designed for 950 students, yet currently it has about 1,700 students. They are burdened with more than 40 portable classrooms, a sinking canteen and inadequate toilet facilities. The overcrowding and lack of modern educational spaces are major barriers to delivering high-quality education. And with the new housing estate being developed around the corner from the school, they'll be facing long-term infrastructure challenges. They desperately need $25 million in federal government funding for a new 3-storey building. This facility would replace ageing demountable structures, provide much-needed classroom space, and ensure our students have access to a learning environment that supports their academic and personal growth. Since my election to this House as the independent member for Fowler, I have continuously spoken about my forgotten community that has long been overlooked by the major parties. A community made up of hard-working people, with young talent, with entrepreneurial spirit, with resilience, with strength, with a rich tapestry of cultures, languages and histories. But it has repeatedly been ignored when it comes to critical investment in many areas like education, health, manufacturing and infrastructure. Over several decades, I have witnessed the government's failure to deliver for the people of Fowler, particularly when it comes to infrastructure funding. I can just hear it now. Election promises of the past will be trotted out over and over again in the next few months, in the lead-up to the next election. But the tangible actions and investment that our community desperately needs have not materialised, as highlighted in the case of Bonnerick High School. This neglect is not just an inconvenience, it is a barrier to our growth and prosperity. Anyone would think that this government wants the people of Fowler to be disadvantaged, vulnerable and reliant on government handouts. Well, we're not. We're not asking for handouts, we're asking for a fair share. What we ask is that the government, whether it be Liberal or Labor, meets us halfway. One of the most important issues we are facing is the need for a metro link between Western Sydney Airport and Parramatta running through Fowler. This infrastructure project is incredibly important, yet this government and New South Wales Labor government cancelled it when they got into power. The Western Sydney Airport is set to become a major hub of economic activity, and without a direct and efficient transport link, the people of Fowler will be cut off from the opportunities it will bring. Imagine the benefits of a metro link: reduced travel times, less congestion on our roads, and greater access to jobs and services. It would open up new possibilities for our residents, allowing them to connect with the broader Sydney region and beyond. This is about equity and ensuring that all communities have the chance to participate in and benefit from growth. It's about making our community a great city to live, work and raise a family. And this is not just about transport. The Metro Link is a clear and tangible way to begin this process, but it must be part of a broader commitment to our community. Our community needs comprehensive investment in infrastructure across the board. We need better healthcare facilities, investment in our schools, and improved public amenities. These are the building blocks of a thriving community, and they are essential for our future. I call on the major parties to recognise the importance of Fowler and to invest in the infrastructure that we need. At the last federal election, the people of Fowler made their voices heard loud and clear. They demonstrated their frustration with being ignored and taken for granted by electing an independent representative. This was a powerful message to the major parties. The people of Fowler will no longer accept being sidelined and treated as second-class citizens. They demand and deserve better. The people of Fowler can no longer be ignored. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, tonight I'd like to speak about an important event that I was proud to co-host together with the member for Nichols last night, where we celebrated the launch of the Parliamentary Friends of Albania group. The co-chair, the member for Nichols, has a very big electorate in the obviously the seat of Nichols. His seat contains a significant amount of Australian Albanians in his community in and around Shepparton, and the same with me in the western suburbs. So this important celebration was held to highlight the strong relationship between Australia and Albania, recognising the rich cultural heritage found in communities across Australia. And members may be aware that Australia established diplomatic relations with Albania in 1985. We enjoyed long-standing people-to-people links with an Albanian presence in Australia dating right back to the late 19th century. The first Albanians, in fact, were recorded in the 1850s in Queensland. Then the second wave after World War I in the very early 20s, and then again after World War II, and then a small wave after 91, once communism collapsed in Albania. The first recorded Albanian to settle in Australia was Naum Konka, who arrived in Brisbane in 1885 with his English wife and decided to stay permanently. However, the first significant Albanian migration to Australia, as I said, started in the 1920s after the United States of America placed migration quotas and restrictions for southern Europeans. So many who arrived in the 1920s settled in rural areas or areas where there was market gardens, and in my electorate, in the western suburbs, there was lots of market gardens and many of them settled around there. Deputy Speaker, the next wave was after World War II. Many were escaping communism for a better life, and many ended up in Australia. And of course, they went on to establish businesses, they worked in all sorts of industries and established themselves and their families. And I'm very proud to have a large Albanian community in the western suburbs of my electorate. Deputy Speaker, in the 2021 census, there were 20,686 Australians declared an Albanian ancestry. And for those odd 20,000, there would be another at least 10 to 15,000 who, for whatever reason, didn't declare their background but are children of many Albanians that have settled here in Australia. The Albanian embassy in Australia is currently headed by His Excellency Mr Adrian Mara, the Albanian ambassador to Australia. His Excellency has been a very active ambassador, and last night's event was a testament to his hard work and tremendous efforts and tremendous celebration of our Albanian Australian community. In fact, we were graced by the attendance of the Prime Minister and a large number of ministers, members of Parliament, and it was tremendous to have that presence there. And I know that His Excellency Ambassador Mara and everyone present was delighted to meet the Prime Minister, whose surname, which is originally Italian, translates to Albanian, in reference to the Abarishi people or Italo-Albanians of southern Italy, or someone of Albanian origin. So they were delighted to meet the Prime Minister last night. Many others in attendance were Her Excellency Jetmira Bedrandja Shalaf, the Ambassador of Kosovo, of course my good friend Judge Ralph Sulio from the District Court of South Australia, Mr Reg Kwamal of Shepparton Albanian Society, Mayor Shane Saley of Shepparton, Mayor Jim McMeddy, Mayor of Greater Dandenong, Mr Ches Jacke and Agron Zanuni, Albanian Australian Association of South Australia. Our South Australian Albanian community are particularly proud that the Adelaide Eagles soccer club based in the Adelaide electorate in Renown Park won the Albanian Cup this year. Miss Karen Rasul from Stanley's Cafe, who was the wonderful chef who did an amazing job feeding so many people last night. And I look forward to this being the first of many parliamentary Friends of Albania functions, and I congratulate His Excellency the Ambassador, Adrian Mara, for his great efforts and work, and for his initiative in arranging this inaugural event. And I'm sure if you did not attend last night, the next one that happens next year, if we're all here, please come along and enjoy some Albanian culture.
I call the member for Forest.
Deputy Speaker, congratulations to Brad and Jodie Adams on their company.